After years away in uniform, Jack Carter finally stood at the doorway of home. His little girl, just 4 years old, froze for a moment, then ran into his arms with tears streaming down her cheeks. With a trembling voice, she whispered, "Daddy, I missed you so much." At his side, Ranger, the battle-scarred K9, lowered his head and gently licked her hand, sealing a reunion that was both tender and fragile. But Jack had no idea that returning home would mean facing something more brutal than the battlefield itself, the judgment of his own neighbors. This is a story about love, loyalty, and the silent courage of a father and his daughter. As you listen, ask yourself, what would you have done if you were in Jack's place? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories of hidden heroes move you, join our community by subscribing. May this story touch your heart, and may you carry its warmth into the rest of your day. The morning sun stretched thin ribbons of gold across the parade ground, casting long shadows of soldiers standing at attention. The air was crisp, laced with the scent of fresh-cut grass and faint traces of oil from vehicles lined along the road. It was a day of ceremony, the kind of day that marked an ending and a beginning all at once. The flags rippled gently, the band played softly, and the voice of the commanding officer echoed as names were called, one after another. Jack Carter, a man of 42 with a tall and muscular frame hardened by years of service, stood quietly, his jaw set and eyes distant, absorbing the weight of the moment. He wore his olive-drab jacket, the creases of time etched into its fabric as much as into his own weathered face. Beside him sat Ranger, a German shepherd, 6 years old, broad-shouldered, with a thick coat of black and tan fur that gleamed under the sun. Ranger's ears stood upright, eyes sharp and alert, the posture of a soldier even without the uniform. This dog had been more than a companion. He had been Jack's lifeline during a brutal ambush, dragging him to cover when shrapnel had torn through the night. That bond had been recognized by the military, and today, as Jack received his papers of honorable discharge, Ranger, too, was officially retired, entrusted into Jack's care not as government property but as family. When the ceremony ended, Jack climbed into the back of a military vehicle, his duffel slung over his shoulder, his dog tag cold against his chest. Ranger leapt up beside him, tail wagging once before curling at Jack's boots. The vehicle rumbled away from the base, leaving behind the life Jack had known for decades. His hands rested on his knees, steady but restless, and his eyes shifted between the receding barracks and the horizon ahead. The thought of home felt both comforting and terrifying. He hadn't been there in years, and though blood tied him to that place, time had carved distance. The drive stretched long, through highways lined with autumn trees, their leaves fiery red and gold. Jack leaned back, recalling moments when Ranger had saved lives, when comrades had fallen, when silence screamed louder than explosions. Each memory flickered like an old film, too sharp to ignore, yet too blurred to hold on to. Ranger nudged his leg, a subtle reminder of the present, of the living bond that anchored him to hope. Jack stroked the dog's head, muttering softly, "We're going home, buddy." The shepherd's eyes blinked slowly in response, as if understanding every syllable. At last, the truck slowed before a modest house on the edge of a quiet suburban street. The walls were pale, the roof a little worn, the yard edged by a picket fence chipped by seasons. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the vehicle halted. He stepped down heavily, boots crunching on gravel, his frame casting a tall shadow across the front yard. Ranger followed, his nails tapping the pavement, nose twitching at scents unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Jack looked at the house, his pulse quickening. Inside waited the family he had not seen since before his deployment, the thread of life he had left behind. The front door creaked open, and out stepped Sarah, Jack's aunt, a woman of 55 with graying hair tied neatly in a bun, wearing a plain cardigan over a long dress. Her face bore lines of labor and love, eyes tired but warm. She had been both guardian and mother to Jack's daughter, raising the child with quiet resilience while Jack was gone. Her hands trembled as she reached out, her lips quivering between a smile and tears. "You've come home, Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking as she embraced him. For a moment, the years fell away, and he was no longer the soldier, but the boy she had once guided. From behind Sarah's legs peeked a small figure. Emily Carter, only 4 years old, stood barefoot on the wooden floor, her blonde hair tied into 2 uneven pigtails, her cheeks round and pink from shyness. She wore a simple pink dress, its hem brushing against her knees, and clutched a small, stuffed rabbit to her chest. Her blue eyes widened at the sight of the man before her. She had known him from photographs and bedtime stories, but reality was taller, broader, and somehow more frightening. She hesitated, her lips trembling as tears welled in her eyes. Jack knelt slowly, lowering himself so his eyes were level with hers. He didn't speak at first. He let silence carry the weight of his longing. Emily's small hands clutched the rabbit tighter, her feet shifting uncertainly. Then, like a sudden burst of courage, she let the rabbit drop, sprinted across the porch, and threw her arms around his neck. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice broken but filled with truth. "I missed you." Jack's arms wrapped around her tiny frame, his own eyes wet, his voice rough with emotion as he murmured her name. Ranger stepped closer, his large head dipping, and his warm tongue brushed against Emily's tear-streaked cheek. The little girl laughed through her sobs, the sound bright and raw, a melody Jack thought he'd never hear again. Sarah watched from the doorway, her hands pressed together over her chest, torn between relief and unease. She glanced at Ranger, his powerful form towering beside the child, and whispered, "Jack, the neighbors here won't easily accept a war dog." Her voice carried both worry and warning, the weight of a community's suspicion already heavy in her mind. Jack looked up, his hand still resting on Emily's back, and met his aunt's gaze. His eyes were firm yet gentle, as if to say that Ranger was not just a dog but a brother in arms, a soul that had bled for him. Sarah sighed, torn between fear and trust, knowing this reunion was only the first step of many trials ahead. Jack rose slowly, lifting Emily into his arms, her small fingers tangled in the fabric of his jacket. Ranger circled them, ears pricked, tail swaying softly, always watchful. Jack stood at the threshold, the weight of the past behind him and the uncertain embrace of home before him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a deep breath that wasn't on a battlefield, a breath that smelled of wood, grass, and the faint trace of family dinners long past. He whispered to his daughter, his voice steady, "I'm home, Emily." The words felt both foreign and familiar, a promise that the soldier was ready to learn how to be a father again. The following morning dawned quiet, the sky painted in pale hues of pink and gray, the air cool and touched with the scent of damp earth after the night's dew. Jack rose early, adjusting to the rhythm of civilian life with the discipline ingrained by years of service, and decided that today he would take Emily out for a walk around the neighborhood. He wanted her to feel the world beyond the four walls of Sarah's home, to see the streets and trees where other children played, to breathe the same air as the community they now belonged to. Ranger padded at his heel, ears flicking to every sound, the leather of his black harness creaking softly as his muscles shifted under his coat. Emily clutched Jack's hand tightly, her small fingers gripping his calloused palm, her pigtails bouncing as she trotted beside him, eyes wide with curiosity and a faint nervousness. The suburban streets stretched ahead, rows of modest houses with neatly trimmed lawns, mailboxes standing like silent sentinels at the edges of driveways. A man watering his flowers looked up as Jack passed, nodded briefly, but quickly bent his head again, pretending to be busy. A woman walking her terrier crossed to the other side of the street, her gaze flicking warily toward Ranger before she forced a polite smile. There were greetings here and there, an uncertain wave, a murmured good morning, but beneath the surface lingered unease, a stiffness in posture, a glance too quickly withdrawn. Jack noticed every gesture, every silence, and though his face betrayed nothing, his chest tightened with the weight of silent judgment. It was then that a voice, loud and cutting, broke through the morning calm. "A veteran with nerves shot to pieces dragging a war dog through our street," the man barked. "Who would ever want to live next to that?" The words belonged to Mr. Harold Brown, 48, the neighbor in the house just beyond Sarah's. He was a thick-set man, heavy around the middle, his gray t-shirt stretched across his stomach, his short-cropped hair damp with sweat from minimal effort. His face carried the permanent scowl of a man convinced the world owed him comfort. His small eyes narrowed as he leaned against his fence with folded arms. His voice carried with it a tone of disdain, a judgment sharpened by ignorance and fear. At his side stood Mrs. Linda Brown, 46, her frame slimmer but her expression taut with anxiety, her brown hair tied into a bun that looked like it had been hurriedly twisted in place. She wore a floral blouse and jeans, one hand resting firmly on the shoulder of her son Tommy, 7 years old, a boy with freckles across his nose and sandy blonde hair that fell into his eyes. Tommy had been standing curiously, his gaze fixed on Ranger with the fascination only children could carry, but at his mother's sharp tug he stumbled back, clutching her hand as she hissed under her breath, "Don't go near that house, Tommy. Don't you ever." Her eyes darted at Jack as if he carried with him not only his scars but also danger itself, and she held her son closer as though the very air around Jack was unsafe. Jack slowed his steps, the words sinking deep, heavier than any silence he had endured on foreign soil. Emily looked up at him, confusion etched across her young face, her lips trembling as she whispered so softly it was nearly lost to the breeze, "Daddy, do they not like me?" Her voice was fragile, carrying the raw innocence of a 4-year-old who could not yet separate herself from her father's shadow, who believed every judgment cast upon him extended to her. She tightened her grip on his hand, eyes glistening with tears she tried to hold back. Jack's throat constricted, but he forced his voice steady, lowering his gaze to meet hers as he gently stroked her hair. He said nothing of the venom in the air, only murmured, "It's all right, sweetheart." His large hand rested on her small shoulder, a silent shield against the world's cruelty. Ranger, sensing the tension, let out a low growl that rumbled deep in his chest, his ears tilting back, his amber eyes locked on brown. The dog didn't lunge, did not move beyond Jack's side, but the sound alone carried a warning as primal as it was protective. From the porch behind them, Sarah appeared, having stepped outside to see where Jack had gone. Her cardigan hung loosely over her frame, her hair pinned back but frayed at the edges, and her eyes sharpened as she caught Brown's words. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm, cutting through the uneasy air. "That man," she said, gesturing toward Jack, "has sacrificed more for this country than most will ever understand. He has carried burdens so heavy you wouldn't survive a day in his shoes, and you dare to reduce him to whispers and suspicion just because he walks with the one friend who saved his life?" Her words hung there, sharp and true, but the silence that followed was heavier still. Neighbors paused in their routines, but none spoke up in Jack's defense. Some looked away, suddenly fascinated with their hedges or driveways. Others tightened their lips, unwilling to engage, unwilling to admit fear had twisted into prejudice. The weight of their quiet rejection pressed down on Jack, Sarah, and Emily like a curtain of ice. Ranger's growl subsided, but his stance remained tense, protective, his gaze never leaving the Browns. Jack nodded slightly towards Sarah, his gratitude unspoken but felt, and gently urged Emily forward. He kept his head high, though each step felt burdened with invisible chains, each silent stare another reminder that battles did not always end when the uniform was folded away. Emily clung to his leg, Ranger paced beside him, and Sarah lingered at the doorway, her expression torn between fierce defense and aching worry. The morning had begun with hope of belonging, but it ended in shadows of doubt cast by those too afraid to see the man behind the scars. The sun slanted low in the sky, casting a warm golden haze across the small town park. Children's laughter echoed near the swings, the creak of chains mingling with the hum of cicadas as families scattered across the grass. Jack had chosen this afternoon deliberately, hoping Emily might find joy beyond the shadow of disapproving neighbors. Sarah accompanied them, carrying a folded shawl and settling herself on a wooden bench, her eyes following Emily with both tenderness and caution. Ranger lay at Jack's feet, his sleek black and tan body stretched across the grass, ears twitching as he monitored every sound. Jack watched Emily scramble toward the bright red slide, her pigtails bobbing, her small dress fluttering in the breeze, her high-pitched giggles momentarily lifting the heaviness from his chest. The park seemed ordinary enough, joggers tracing the paved path, a group of teenagers tossing a football, an elderly couple feeding pigeons near the fountain. Jack tried to blend into that ordinariness, his tall frame leaning back against the bench, his eyes adjusting to a life that was slower, softer, and yet edged with tension. Emily waved from the top of the slide, her smile wide and eager, and Jack lifted his hand in return, the simple exchange filling him with a rare warmth. Sarah exhaled slowly beside him, the lines of worry on her face easing just a fraction. Ranger's head rested on his paws, though his eyes remained open, scanning, never fully at rest. It happened quickly, like the flicker of a shadow across bright light. A young man in a hooded sweatshirt lingered near the fountain, his posture hunched, his eyes darting nervously. He looked to be in his early 20s, wiry, with pale skin and restless hands that betrayed both impatience and intent. His target was an elderly woman seated nearby, her silver hair tucked beneath a sun hat, her frail hands fumbling with the clasp of her purse. The young man's fingers slipped deftly into the bag, extracting a wallet in one practiced motion. But before he could turn away, a deep bark exploded across the park. Ranger's body surged upright, muscles taut, his tail stiff as his paws dug into the earth. He lunged forward, barking in a rhythm that was sharp, commanding, and impossible to ignore. His hackles rose, his amber eyes locked on the thief. The young man froze for an instant, panic flashing across his face, then bolted, dropping the wallet as he sprinted away. The old woman shrieked in surprise, her voice trembling as she clutched at her purse. But the scene unfolded too quickly for bystanders to piece together. What they saw was a large German shepherd leaping forward with a ferocious bark, its growl tearing through the tranquil afternoon. Screams followed almost immediately. A mother grabbed her toddler, clutching him to her chest as she yelled, "That dog is out of control!" A man near the picnic table shouted, "Someone call the police! That thing's dangerous." The football thudded to the ground as teenagers scattered, eyes wide with alarm. The elderly woman, though shaken, clutched her purse silently, too stunned to explain, while chaos rippled outward in waves. Jack sprang to his feet, calling Ranger back with a sharp command, his voice steady, the same voice that had once carried over battlefields. Ranger halted, circling back to his side, chest heaving but posture obedient. Still, the damage was done. By the time the blue lights of a patrol car flickered at the park entrance, fear had already hardened into judgment. The crowd murmured in unison, snippets of accusation swirling. "A war dog shouldn't be here. That man's unstable. It'll bite someone next." Emily clung to Jack's leg, her wide eyes brimming with tears, unable to understand why joy had turned to dread so suddenly. Sarah rose from the bench, her jaw clenched, fury simmering as she prepared to defend Jack, but before she could speak, the officer approached. Officer Daniel Miller, 35, stepped onto the path with a measured gait. He was tall, clean-shaven, with a square jaw and eyes that carried both weariness and suspicion. His navy blue uniform was crisp, his badge polished, and his belt weighed down with radio and holster. He had the air of a man who had seen too many petty disputes escalate into disasters. His gaze swept across the murmuring crowd before fixing sharply on Jack, then on Ranger, who stood firmly at attention, his harness marked K9. Veteran Miller's brows knitted as he spoke, his tone firm but edged with distrust. "Sir, you're going to have to show me proof this animal is authorized and properly trained." Jack's hand moved to his pocket with deliberate calm, producing a folded envelope containing Ranger's discharge papers and service dog certification. He held them out steadily, his eyes meeting the officer's without flinching. "He's retired military K9, Jack said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of truth. "He served honorably. He's under control." Miller scanned the documents, his jaw tightening as though paperwork did little to quiet the murmurs surrounding him. He lowered the papers slowly, his voice hardening. "I've seen too many veterans lose control, and I won't let a combat-trained dog become a threat to this community. You may trust him, but I don't." The words sliced deeper than Miller might have intended. Jack felt Emily's small hand clutch tighter at his leg, her trembling body pressed against him. She looked up at the officer, her eyes swimming with tears, her voice breaking as she cried out, "Don't take Ranger. He's good. He's my friend." Her plea pierced the air, raw and innocent, echoing louder than the accusations of the crowd. For a fleeting moment, silence hung heavy over the park. A few faces softened, uncertainty flickering, but suspicion remained like a stubborn shadow. Sarah stepped closer, her voice fierce but quivering. "That dog just stopped a thief. Ask the woman by the fountain. She knows the truth." But the old woman, still shaken, could only nod faintly, her voice too weak to carry against the tide of noise. Miller hesitated, his eyes shifting between the papers in his hand, the frightened child clinging to her father, and the restless crowd demanding safety. His silence was not mercy but calculation, a man torn between law, duty, and perception. Jack drew Emily into his arms, his free hand resting on Ranger's harness. His face betrayed no anger, only the steady endurance of a man who had faced fire and still stood. Around him, whispers continued, sharp and unyielding, a chorus of fear louder than any truth spoken. The golden light of the afternoon dimmed as clouds rolled across the sky, the park's laughter silenced, replaced by an uneasy hush. Emily buried her face in Jack's shoulder, her sobs muffled but unrelenting. Ranger leaned closer, his body pressed against Jack's leg, loyal and still, a soldier waiting for his next command. When Miller finally handed back the papers, his expression remained guarded, his words clipped. "Keep him under control. This is a neighborhood, not a battlefield." The warning lingered like smoke, even as he turned away. The crowd dispersed slowly, suspicion clinging to their shoulders as they walked off. Jack remained still, Sarah at his side, Emily in his arms, and Ranger steady at his heel. The misunderstanding had passed, but its mark lingered, deepening the distance between a man who had given everything and a community that could not yet see beyond its fear. The storm pressed down on the neighborhood with merciless weight, sheets of rain hammering rooftops while jagged flashes of lightning split the sky. Thunder rolled like distant artillery, rattling windows and shaking the earth beneath their feet. Inside Sarah's modest home, Jack remained near the window, his broad shoulders framed by the dim glow of a lamp as he kept his gaze fixed on the storm, a soldier's stillness masking the tension in his chest. Sarah moved quietly, folding clothes but unable to hide her restless glances, while Emily stirred in her blanket on the couch, her small face troubled even in half-sleep. Ranger lay on the floor, head resting on his paws but ears twitching at every rumble, the quiet guardian who never truly slept. The scream tore through the night suddenly, louder than thunder, carrying raw terror that pierced the walls of every home. "Fire! The brown house is on fire!" The words echoed again, shriller, drawing neighbors into the street despite the storm's fury. Jack pulled open the door and saw the glow that needed no explanation, an orange inferno devouring the Browns' home. Flames shot skyward, smoke gushed from shattered windows, and the storm itself seemed powerless, rain turning instantly into steam where it struck the blaze. The air smelled of burning wood, plastic, and fear, thick and suffocating. The neighborhood descended into chaos, people rushing barefoot into the rain, umbrellas collapsing in the wind, their voices panicked and uneven. Harold Brown, a heavy-set man of 48, knelt in the mud with his shirt plastered to his wide chest, his thinning hair glued to his forehead by sweat and rain. His eyes were red and frantic, his voice cracking as he cried, "Tommy, my boy is still inside. Please, someone, save him." His wife Linda clutched his arm desperately, her floral blouse soaked, her hair falling loose across her face, her sobs breaking into the roar of the storm. The fire roared back, drowning hope with each crack of splintering wood. The crowd pressed toward the house, but stumbled back as the heat blasted against them, the flames forcing them to retreat. Phones glowed in trembling hands as calls to firefighters were made, but everyone knew the trucks would take too long, the fire spreading faster than any rescue could arrive. "They're coming!" someone shouted, though their tone betrayed little conviction. Another man pulled his child away, shaking his head with hopeless certainty. "No one survives that." Fear took hold of every person in the street, paralyzing their bodies, anchoring their feet, and leaving a boy's life to the mercy of fire. Jack turned to see Sarah clutching Emily in the shelter of the porch, the storm soaking her cardigan as she shielded the little girl against her chest. Emily's eyes were wide, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Daddy, don't go." The words fragile, her voice breaking under the weight of fear. Sarah's expression was lined with terror, torn between the instinct to hold Jack back and the knowledge that his resolve was already unshakable. "Jack, it's too dangerous!" she shouted, her voice hoarse, but her plea was already too late. He stood straighter, his eyes locked on the blaze with a soldier's grim certainty. Jack knelt before Emily, brushing rain and tears from her soft cheek, pressing a kiss against her damp forehead as he whispered, "Stay with your aunt." Emily shook her head violently, sobbing into his chest, her small fists pounding weakly. "Please, Daddy, don't leave me," she begged, her words breaking his heart more than the fire across the street. Jack swallowed hard, forcing his voice steady, promising, "I'll come back." "I promise." He rose, tugged his jacket tight, and glanced at Ranger. The German shepherd was already standing tall, ears pricked, muscles taut, his amber eyes fixed on the burning house as though he understood his duty as well as any soldier. Together, man and dog sprinted into the storm, their shadows swallowed by the rain and light of fire. The Browns' front door glowed with flame, wood blackened and crackling, and Jack drove his shoulder into it with a force that shattered it inward. Smoke billowed out, thick and acrid, choking his lungs instantly, but he pushed forward. Inside, the air was an oven of heat and chaos, walls streaked with fire, beams groaning above. Ranger darted ahead through the smoke, barking sharply, his voice cutting through the roar of flames, his training guiding him like a compass. The staircase groaned as fire crawled up its edges, sparks raining down on their heads, but they pressed upward. Then Jack heard it, faint but distinct. A child's sob, weak and trembling, almost drowned beneath the blaze. He stumbled down the hallway, boots striking glass and debris, and saw Tommy huddled in the corner of a bedroom, his face streaked with soot, freckles barely visible beneath the grime. His arms were wrapped around his knees, his body shaking with terror as he cried for his mother. When his eyes found Jack, they widened in disbelief. This was the neighbor his father distrusted, now charging through fire to save him. "Tommy!" Jack shouted, his voice breaking through smoke as he rushed forward. He scooped the boy into his arms, coughing violently as his lungs clawed for air. "I've got you," he rasped, his voice raw but steady. Tommy clung to his neck desperately, sobbing into his chest, his small frame trembling like a leaf. Ranger barked from his doorway, urging them back toward safety, but as they turned, the shepherd yelped in sudden pain. His paw had struck broken glass, a deep cut forcing him into a limp, but his spirit did not falter. He barked again, sharp and insistent, forcing himself forward despite the wound. They stumbled through collapsing hallways, each step a fight against heat and smoke. A section of ceiling groaned and fell, embers exploding around them, but Jack shielded Tommy with his body and pressed forward, Ranger limping at his side, his loyalty unshaken. The front doorway loomed ahead, glowing with the red of hell itself, and Jack lunged through it, his muscles screaming with exhaustion. They burst into the yard, the storm crashing against them, smoke chasing their heels as they tumbled into the mud. Jack fell to his knees, clutching Tommy close, gasping for clean air, while Ranger staggered behind, his paw bloodied but his head held high. For a moment, silence ruled the crowd. Neighbors stood frozen in disbelief, their fear choking them as they stared at the man, the child, and the wounded dog who had defied the fire. Then the silence shattered. Linda Brown screamed with relief, rushing forward to pull Tommy into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably into his soot-stained hair. Harold collapsed beside Jack, clutching his sleeve with trembling hands, his face streaked with rain and tears. "You saved him," he choked, his voice raw with disbelief and gratitude. "You saved my boy." The crowd erupted into cries, some covering their mouths, others clapping, their awe rising into the storm as rain poured down over them all. Rain still poured in heavy curtains, though the fire at the Brown house had weakened under its assault, leaving behind a skeleton of blackened beams and smoldering embers. The storm had not yet passed, but its rage had dulled, replaced by the uneven rhythm of distant thunder and the steady hiss of rain on ash. Neighbors stood scattered across the muddy street, their faces pale with shock, their clothes clinging to their skin, their eyes fixed on Jack, Emily, and Ranger, as though witnessing something beyond their understanding. The silence of disbelief lingered, broken only by the sobs of Linda Brown as she clutched Tommy against her chest. Harold Brown staggered forward, still unsteady, his thick frame shuddering as though it bore the weight of both relief and guilt. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes swollen and red, tears mixing with rain as he dropped heavily to his knees in front of Jack. His voice cracked, the words rasping from a throat raw with smoke and emotion. "Carter, I was wrong. I misjudged you, every word I said about you, about your dog. I was blind. You saved my son. I owe you his life, and I will never be able to repay you." The words fell heavily, genuine in their surrender, carrying the burden of a man whose pride had been broken by truth. The neighbors shifted uneasily, their whispers lost to the storm, while Sarah stood nearby with her hand pressed to her mouth, tears shining in her eyes. Emily clung to her father's leg, trembling with the aftermath of terror, her blue eyes darting between the adults. Jack met Harold's gaze in silence, the anger of past insults gone, replaced with something steadier, an understanding of the frailty of fear. His hand came to rest on Harold's shoulder briefly, a gesture without words, neither absolution nor condemnation, but a soldier's acknowledgement of another man's vulnerability. Harold bowed his head, shoulders shaking, before pulling his wife and son close again. Out of the crowd stepped Officer Daniel Miller, the tall, clean-shaven man in his Navy uniform, his square jaw set in an expression both hard and uncertain. His boots splashed against the puddled street as he approached, his badge catching the dim light of the storm. He had been the one to doubt the veteran most fiercely, the one who had seen danger instead of loyalty in the bond between man and dog. Now, standing before Jack, his voice was firm, but the edge of suspicion was gone. "I was wrong too," Miller admitted, his tone low but clear. "I thought you and that dog were a threat, a risk to this community. Tonight you proved the opposite. You protected us when we stood frozen. You carried the weight none of us would bear." Jack said nothing at first, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling as he drew in the smoky, rain-heavy air. Ranger stood beside him, still limping on his injured paw, but with his head high, his amber eyes calm and watchful. Emily slipped from her father's grasp and knelt beside the shepherd, wrapping her small arms around his thick neck. Her voice was faint, broken with the residue of tears, but it carried across the street as she whispered, "I love you, Ranger. You're my best friend." The words, simple and innocent, cut deeper than any speech, a child's truth echoing louder than applause. Sarah moved closer, her own tears spilling freely now, her hand brushing against Jack's arm as she spoke through the storm. "This family, it's whole again. You've carried pain for too long, Jack, but tonight showed us what it really means to come home." Her words trembled but shone with pride, her eyes soft with relief as she gazed at her nephew. Jack lowered himself slowly to the ground, one arm around Emily, the other around Ranger, pulling both into his chest as though anchoring himself to the only things that mattered. His eyes glistened, moisture from rain mixing with tears, but within them was a light of peace he had not felt in years. "We're home now," he murmured, his voice quiet but certain, words not just for Emily but for himself, for Sarah, for Ranger, and perhaps even for the neighbors who had judged too quickly. Emily pressed her face into his shoulder, her small hand resting against Ranger's fur, while the shepherd leaned heavily into Jack, loyal even in pain. The three of them, battered and weary, radiated a unity that no prejudice could shake, an image of love and courage that silenced even the harshest critics. Around them, the neighbors' eyes softened. Some still glanced with hesitation, their suspicion not yet fully erased, but many bowed their heads in quiet recognition. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, not of disdain, but of humility, words unspoken yet clear. They had witnessed the strength of a man and his dog, not as symbols of fear, but as protectors, silent heroes who had given without hesitation. Even those who had turned their backs before could not deny the truth that had unfolded before them in the storm. The fire hissed low as rain beat against the last embers, the storm beginning to fade into the early hours of dawn. The Browns clung to each other. Miller stood back with his jaw clenched in reflection, and Sarah wrapped her arms around Jack's shoulders, the circle of family closing around him once more. For the first time since his return, Jack felt no weight of judgment pressing on his back, only the warmth of belonging. It was not the parade ground or the battlefield that defined his homecoming, but this moment, standing in the rain with his daughter and his dog, the neighbors watching in humbled silence. In that quiet, broken only by the patter of rain, Jack Carter knew the war was over at last. Not the war fought with guns and fire, but the silent one he had carried within himself. And as Emily's small voice whispered again into Ranger's fur, "You're my best friend," Jack closed his eyes, his arms holding both daughter and dog, and let peace settle into the cracks of his weary heart. This story reminds us that true heroes often walk among us quietly, carrying scars that others may never see. Jack and Ranger showed that courage is not only found on battlefields, but in the strength to protect, forgive, and love, even when the world doubts you. It is a lesson about overcoming prejudice, about the silent sacrifices that make life safer and kinder for us all. I invite you to share this story, to comment with your own reflections, and to subscribe to be part of a community that values compassion and dignity. May God bless every one of you who listens, and may you carry the spirit of kindness into your own lives.